Welcome to the introduction to the class Reclaim Your Life, a journey of deconstruction and healing. My name is David Teachout. I am a mental health therapist and coach working with adults primarily, but also couples who are often struggling with issues related to identity and trauma. And this class is primarily focused then on the trauma and difficulties that stem from leaving an authoritarian style of religious ideology. Although the emphasis here is very much on the authoritarian aspect of it rather than simply the religious. And the reason for that is that religion doesn't corner the market on offering up ideologies that are limiting and honestly destructive when it comes to one's ability to make decisions about their life, ask questions, form relationships that are helpful and nuanced and capable of celebrating the variations with which we deal with life and make decisions about ourselves and ethics and how we're going to show up in changing life circumstances. So while the examples and the primary focus may end up being necessarily then about religion, the focus within that religious ideology is going to be its authoritarian, dualistic, basically non-humanistic ideological structure. And we're going to get into that briefly. Again, this is an introduction, of course, to the entire class. And for that, we're going to take a look then at a kind of definition that is offered by the APA concerning then trauma, and taking a look then at what it means to have a religious context when we're talking about here. And for that, the APA defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event that involves death, the likely possibility of death, to self or others, where such will often include shock and denial of the event and later various emotional and physiological responses. Now, we're going to take that and put it within that religious context. And for that, I'm going to take from a paper written by, Dr. Oxlander, where he defines religion as being the search for individual and social significance within established institutions designed to facilitate spirituality, where spirituality is broadly understood as the search for the sacred, with such including a god, a higher power, the divine, or some form of transcendence. And so with that, we're going to combine these two and look at this from basically trauma from within a religious context. Now, the shorthand that we often talk about is religious trauma. But the emphasis that I'm bringing to this is a difference in noting that religious trauma is not unique. It is not a special form of where the traumatic experience is somehow different in form to other traumatic experiences. The difference is found in the content. The difference is found in the particular examples and personal experiences that happen. But the trauma itself is still the same, because trauma is a reaction to fill in the blank. So, with that in mind, we're going to take a look then at trauma from within a religious context. And here's a definition that I am currently working through and working from. And that is the instability and uncertainty in identity, social relationships, and navigating life direction choices resulting from the personal experiences had within a group given structure by a religious or other authoritarian worldview. There's that emphasis again on authoritarianism. But note here that there are two examples that really hone in on what is happening in that traumatic experience. What does trauma broadly lead to? And that is that instability and uncertainty in identity, relationships, and basically how are we going to direct what we are going to do next in our lives. And that can include ethics and career choices and so on. But it's that instability and uncertainty because trauma is about being removed from or kind of jarred out of how we are currently operating in our lives. It is an aberrant experience that says, wait, the way that I understood life doesn't make any sense anymore. That the way that I was making decisions, the structure that provided me the context, the boundaries for how I was going to think about myself, the people in my life, and the direction that I was taking in my life now doesn't make any sense. That the certainty is gone. And that's trauma. It's that experience. And that's why here, trauma from within a religious context is so important to understand, because it's not that we are necessarily getting rid of all things even potentially associated with religion, but we're getting away from and acknowledging that there are aspects within certain forms of religious experience that lend itself to experiencing trauma. So that's the starting point that we're going to be from. So one thing that I'm not going to do is look at going after, and debating and showing why particular dogmas in particular religious ideologies are wrong. This is not a anti-apologetics class. This is about identifying those ideas that are structurally destructive to our lives and lend itself then to that instability and uncertainty. That in some ways, the authoritarian religious structure is itself a trauma. That the existence of it will tend to, particularly when one starts to question and challenge these things, and certainly when it is left behind. Then, in a way, the very fact that the authoritarian religious structure does not allow for nuance and the capacity to be wrong actually leads to is itself a problem for what it means to be human. And so, with that in mind, we are looking then at often many of these behavioral things that come out of having that traumatic experience and looking at life as going, I don't know what comes next. What am I supposed to think? How am I supposed to think? And so we'll have confusing thoughts and a reduced ability to think critically, negative beliefs about self, others, the world, trouble making decisions, feelings of depression, anxiety, grief, that loss of certainty, anger, even lethargy, that kind of like, oh, what am I even supposed to do now? I don't even feel like putting one foot in front of the other. There's that sense of feeling lost again, directionless, alone. Often there will be a lack of pleasure or interest in things that you used to enjoy. There is, of course, a loss of community quite often, either by your choice or by those who have judged your differences and said, no, that's a sin or you need to be cut off. There's, of course, then leading that to the feelings of isolation, that sense of you don't belong anymore. And depending on where you came out of and the degree of cultishness and isolation that the authoritarian religious community gave you, you may be feeling a sense of being behind the times, literally quite often cut off from the rest of the world and wondering, now what? What do I even wear? I don't mean to be dismissive on that. I mean, it's just, it really is that sense of like when you're wandering around, depending on how isolated you may have been, there's that sense of going, how do I fit anymore? The world has moved on and I'm left behind. And so this class will have 6 lessons. Each is going to have a video presentation. And every lesson will include a new way of thinking, a new process or framework to reflect on and consider for yourself, while also then providing a practice that you can do in your life on your own time as often as you would like to help you explore that new way of thinking on your own. And of course, every lesson will include further reading to develop the ideas. Because in another life, I swear, I was a librarian. I love giving resources. I love giving things that are going to be helpful for your own reflection, because I am not here to become your next guru. I'm not here to become your next priest. Certainly not. I am definitely not here to become your next source of authority. This is about your own betterment, your own journey in creating and exploring a new framework based in naturalism and humanism that provides the means by which you can think about yourself, relationships in your life, and your own life direction. And so each lesson will provide that initial introductory process and juxtapose it with a framework that came out of that religious ideology. And so that you can compare very easily, oh, this is what I'm struggling with, and this is where I would like to go next. Here's where I'm coming out of, and this is where I'm going towards. And briefly, as an overview, lesson 1 is going to touch on, are my thoughts still a problem? You know, that bone deep sense, particularly out of the religious dogma that says that who you are is intrinsically evil, wrong, or sinful, fallen, cut off from and removed from the divine grace. That the only way then to feel better about yourself is to literally change your thoughts. And of course, quickly here, no, your thoughts are not a problem. But we'll go into that much more in the lesson. And that's where we'll go into disconnecting then thought from action so that you can, in practice, increase the awareness that you have through mindful acceptance of what it means to be human and how to relate oneself to one's own thoughts in such a way that they do not define you. They're simply part of the human experience. Lesson 2 will then cover how should I think about myself now? Now that we've understood that my thoughts are not in a simple one-to-one relationship equated to who I am, then in fact who I am is much broader than that. How else should I think about myself? What is the nature of what it means to be human? And the practice of that will be then embracing yourselves. I do mean that in the plural, not in some kind of, clinical diagnostic perspective, but in the plurality of what it means to live our lives in various ways, in various contexts, in decision making process that allows us to express ourselves in so many different ways without getting caught up in the singularity of a single self, a kind of homunculus that says I must live life simply and in a isolated and limited fashion, with the practice then being about how to take those perspectives and allow us that imaginative process for looking at what the futures, plural, we can kind of embrace and figure out like, okay, if I go this, it might go here. If I go this choice, I could go over there. And understanding that life is a lot more gray areas than what the authoritarian religious background would have us believe. Lesson 3 is very much about morality. Where do I go for morality and ethics? And we will very much be looking at going away from that authoritarian structure that says almost a kind of vertical dogmatism, declaring that the leader or authority figure or authority organization gets to decide what is right and wrong in a very black and white binary perspective. Then in fact, life is a lot more complicated and for good reason. And with that, we'll be looking at the process of how to identify values as human rather than divine, and actually using values as a starting process for exploring what it means to create meaning and purpose and direction in our lives so that we can then, in practice, connect behavior to those things we care about, our values. Lesson 4, do my actions still have significance? This is one of the, frankly, most pernicious qualities of coming out of a high control authoritarian worldview, is that we struggle to see just why our lives are meaningful anymore, that our actions can and should and always have had purpose, meaning, and importance. Now, that importance may no longer be connected to some divine war, some cosmic force, but it in no way diminishes what it means to act in this world as we attempt to create this life that we have. And in exploring that, we'll look for that rejection of the binary of good and evil, black and white, this or that. That we can, in fact, be much more nuanced in how we look at our lives. And the practice that we'll be covering is seeking out and exploring alternative views by basically playing with imagination. I mean, imagination is the power of creativity. It's the soup. It's the energy that allows us to see things differently and explore new options. So I'll give a little bit of a practice on what to do with that. Lesson 5. How do I relate to people? So we've kind of gone over how do I think about myself? What do I do when it concerns morality and ethics? How do I make decisions? Why do my actions matter? And of course, what does ethics mean in relation to the relationships we have with others? Family, friends, social connections, broadly institutions, and everything in that. How do I relate? And with that, we're going to take a look at people and relationships as now being what truly matters. That contrary to what the authoritarian religious background would say, in that, frankly, the divine is all that matters, that people are merely tools for the betterment and worship of the authority, that in fact it is the people and the relationships that are really what's important, because the divine never existed. It never has. It does not now. It will not in the future. What exists is us, you and me, figuring things out. And the practice for exploring that will be how to actively appreciate the world itself, trying new things, using that imagination to challenge what it means to look at the world, to question perhaps that how I see things is limited. And that isn't just a good thing, it's an awesome thing. That in the practice of challenging what we think, that is where freedom comes. And that is where we find out just what it means to be human together. In the last lesson, 6, where do I go from here? We've covered basically, well, the basics. How do I think about myself? Ethics, relationships, actions, connecting behavior to what matters. So now what? What am I supposed to do? And of course, remember, I'm not here to be your guru. So where do I go from here is not my answer to give. And so where we find that is through individual and relational practice, through exploration of how to live a life through naturalism and humanism, how to embrace and find purpose and freedom in what it is to embrace this human creature that has come out of natural processes. And so taking the time to practice creative and look at new interests, maybe not necessarily to, identify your life with, but just to try new things. And doing so without fear of judgment, without fear of going, am I inside or now am I outside of God's plan? Because there is none. It's just us. And that can actually be pretty fun. And so, having completed all that and looked at the intro, very much hope that you sign up and join me on that journey. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out anytime. My email address, david.teachout@lifeweavings.com. You can go to my website, lifeweavings.com, and of course, my Substack, where I write and post interviews with other therapists and those who are struggling with their own means of identifying meaning, purpose, and coming out of isolating authoritarian worldviews. Can be found at humanitiesvalues.com. Thank you and welcome.